Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the American Club of Hamburg on Zoom. Before I get started, I just wanted to remind people that we will be starting in-person events. We had an event last week and there's a couple more events coming up. March 8th and April 5th, we'll be at the Botanist Bar next to the Meadery restaurant at the Side Hotel. And we have some other events that we're planning in person, and you'll get invitations soon. Tonight, we have Michael Werz. He's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and he's also a board member of Atlantic Brücke. He's here to speak about transatlantic challenges between US and Germany, and obviously in light of the developments with Ukraine, that will be part of the topic. And he just came back from the Munich Security Conference, just returned to his home in Washington, DC, and luckily we were able to have him here live with us tonight. Welcome, Michael. Michael's going to speak about for about 15-20 minutes, give us a little bit of the state of things. And so if you have questions, please send them. Let me know in the chat that you have a question. Maybe give me a little indication of what the topic is, and then I will call on you, and we'll continue like that. So welcome, everyone. Welcome, Michael. Great to have you here.
Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you all for making time during a work day in the evening to talk about the United States and about Germany. I very much appreciate that opportunity. I hope all is well in Hamburg, one of my favorite cities. As David mentioned, I'm just back in Washington after a few days in Germany at the Munich Security Conference, and the impressions of Munich kind of forced me to rethink ways in which we are talking about the transatlantic, or more specifically the German-American relationship, and also about some, I would say, deficiencies in understanding the tremendous transformations that we are undergoing here as American society. So David was generous enough to give me 15 or 20 minutes to just throw a few thoughts at you, which I think are an important framework and an important underpinning for German-American conversations going forward, because we obviously cannot go back to the 20th century and the tradition in which transatlantic relations grew up and were established in the first place. Here in the United States, we are undergoing a massive transformation. I would say there is there are three layers of geopolitical change and also a massive domestic transformation. And all of these four developments are important because my feeling is, and that is based upon many conversations with German and other European policymakers and political representatives in Munich, if you don't understand these transformations, it's really hard to grasp what is happening in the United States. Because obviously we live in a time where the clear-cut borders between domestic and foreign policy are increasingly blurred. And maybe the separation between domestic and foreign was an artifact of the Cold War, but obviously today things are much more muddled. Foreign policy requires a much greater domestic legitimacy than before. And also policymakers are often tempted to use foreign policy in order to gain domestic political gain. And that is, as I said, a complicated situation. Here in the United States, three things are important when it comes to our geopolitical or international outlook. One is, and this is has direct implications for Europe, is the declining importance of the Middle East. It is absolutely clear, if you look at the current National Security Council here in Washington, DC, that the Middle East is decreasing in importance. It's not only that President Biden, when he was elected, didn't really talk to any of the Arab leaders, and even Bibi Netanyahu had to wait for 3 weeks to get a phone call with the president. We also moved relatively quickly to ending our support for the Saudi air war in Yemen. We cut some weapon sales to the region. The United States was very restrained after, you might remember, a year and a half ago, a little over a year ago, some of our forces were attacked in northern Iraq. And it is clear, if you talk to people in the National Security Council, they explicitly say Middle East is not a top 3 priority anymore. The oil age is over. And I think this is something that in Europe hasn't really sunken in, because it means that Europe like it or not, needs to look much more at the region because it is in greater proximity than to us. Secondly, and even less cognizant in many European discussions, is that the increasing importance of the Pacific is real. And it's not only because we like to tangle in a geopolitical confrontation with China. It has to do with the fact that our Asian allies are standing in line here in Washington, from the Philippines to South Korea to Japan, including Australia and New Zealand and even Vietnam, and are asking and demanding stability guarantees and support from the United States. This is not something that we can ignore here. This is a pressing issue because people in those countries want to make sure that they can live a self-determined life in democratic, more or less democratic societies in some cases. And there is such a demand structure that we can't really close our eyes. And I think this is important to recognize. If you have time to reread Kamala Harris's speech that she gave in Singapore a few months back, I think that was an interesting speech that tried to lay out some of the new paradigms has been, as far as I can tell, overlooked in Europe. So this is a second point. First is declining importance of the Middle East. The second is massively increasing importance of the Pacific. And the third, and I think that is really not being felt in Europe enough, is the rapid integration of North America, meaning Canada, the United States, and Mexico, especially the US and Mexico. It's not only that we are the largest Spanish-speaking country in the world after Mexico. We have over 60 million Latinos in this country. About 1/4 of the Mexican population is Mexican-American. In 2050, about 100 million Latinos will live in this country. Latinos right now are already an economic powerhouse. The Latino GDP in the United States is larger than Russia's. And the integration between the US and Mexico is as tight as can be. There's close to $1.8 billion in commodities that cross our border every day. And there's high-tech products in the aerospace and car sector where technical parts cross the border up to 6 times during the production process. So I think this is important because the increasing integration of North America also, to a degree, speeds up the development of our Pacific integration, because Mexico and also Canada are countries that are very active economically and politically in the Pacific arena. So these are the three, I would say, international or geopolitical tendencies that you have to keep in mind when you're talking about Ukraine, about German-American relations, or about the future of transatlantic cooperation. The fourth dimension is domestic. And I think this is important, as I said before, because domestic and international and foreign policy are so much more interconnected now that it is really important to realize that we are facing a new political era here in the United States. That has to do with the fact that traditional American conservatism, enlightened conservatism of the party of Abraham Lincoln is gone, and a transformation of the Republican Party has come to a preliminary end, I would say. One has to recognize that the election of Joe Biden is nothing more but a respite that provides us with some breathing room, but the real historical election in which we're going to decide here in the United States whether the democratic experiment that started in 1776 will go on untarnished and undamaged is 2024. And so I think this is important, and I wanted to mention 3 points that I think are relevant to understand the domestic turmoil here in the United States, because the domestic situation increasingly codes and embeds foreign policy decisions. If you have seen the press conference of Olaf Scholz and Joe Biden here in Washington, it was really interesting that it was hard to disentangle to which degree Olaf Scholz was talking foreign affairs or domestic German or SPD policies when he didn't want to mention Nord Stream 2. And it was equally difficult to disentangle whether Joe Biden was talking white voters in the Midwest and his desire to appear strong against the criticisms of Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, his major opponents on the foreign policy side in the Republican Party, when he said Nord Stream 2 is over and we will push back no matter what. So I think it is important to better understand the dynamics here in the US. I see massive deficiencies, quite frankly, in German policymaking because most of the people that inhabit our world of foreign affairs, they are not really country experts, they are more relationship experts. And that needs to change if you are serious about trying to rethink how Germany and the United States and Europe and the United States can actually shape the 21st century, create policy outcomes, make sure that the multilateral system doesn't implode, and make sure that we can live in relatively self-determined democratic environments in the future. Let me just mention three things that have really changed the domestic dynamic here in the United States. One is social polarization. And I know that this is being discussed a lot in the media, but I think it is important to recognize that even though there is sufficient social polarization in European countries as well, here in the United States, the situation is much more advanced, and it is creating tension that push the fabrics of the body politics and of our society to the limits, and also create anxieties of loss of status and of wealth by people that are completely established in the middle classes and upper middle classes. Let me just give you one data point, which I think is important here. The RAND Corporation, which is a government-financed massive research organization, a fairly traditional one, put out a report a while ago where they looked at the development of social polarization in the United States. So they looked at the first 30 years after the Second World War, from 1948 to 1975, where there was a decent amount of social polarization, and said, would social polarization have stayed the same after 1975 to 2018, the way it was in the previous 30 years? What would have happened? And what they could calculate was that the transfer of wealth that we have seen from the bottom to the top of American society was absolutely staggering. The bottom 90% of American society had social polarization stayed the way it was the first 30 years after the Second World War, would have been $2.5 trillion larger in 2018. That is nearly 12% of our GDP. To put it in different terms, because these numbers are not really, it's very hard to realize what they mean. RAND calculated that over the past 30 years, the transfer of money from the lower 90% to the top 10% in American society amounts to a salary that could have been paid to every American household of $1,144 a month over the past 30 years. So I just mentioned these numbers because this is one of the reasons why we are seeing the political conflicts that we see, why the situation is so hardened in so many regards, because there are massive social anxieties, even among people that are relatively well established and don't really have to fear that they're going to be impoverished anytime soon. But the fact that our society sees increasing polarization at the rate it does is creating anxieties and insecurities that have direct political impact. Second point. I've mentioned that we have seen a tremendous change in American conservatism. If you remember, maybe you do, maybe you don't, or if you have ever read General Eisenhower's goodbye speech in 1961 when he stepped down as a president. In his farewell address, he said that the United States should be a society, and that was obviously in the context of the Cold War and the communist threat, should not fall prey to terrible fear and hatred, but America should be a proud confederation of mutual trust and respect. And if you fast forward 50 years on, and that lifetime later, Donald Trump in 2017, at his inauguration speech here at the Washington Mall, about a mile and a half from my house, said that the American bloodbath will end here and now. And he was murmuring and speaking about the disintegration of American society in apocalyptic terms. And I think that disparity shows that we now are dealing with a very different brand of conservatism that has very little to no space for political dissenters, and is also creating a situation of complete deadlock in the House of Representatives and the US Senate. That's a political situation that is very difficult and dangerous for us because we find ourselves in a political environment in which we need to move forwards because we have a lot of regulations, laws, and political procedures that are completely outdated. And this seriously hampers the opportunity for the United States and the capacity to modernize US society in economic, social, health, technological, and other terms. One of the underpinnings, of course, is that we have what a recent study at the University of Southern California that has, believe it or not, the Schwarzenegger Institute for Policy, called a minoritarian poison in a recent study, where they documented that after the 2018 election, about 60 million Americans live in states where actually a party is in government that received less votes than the other party. And the most impactful examples that they found were Wisconsin, where in 2018, the Republican Party got 44% of the vote, but controlled 64.5% of the seats in the state assembly. And in Virginia, it was similar, 44% of the vote and about 51% of the assembly. And this is important because these are relevant swing states that decide presidential elections, but it also shows a structural deficit in our political system where only one house in the Congress, namely the House of Representatives, is representative, where the Senate and the Electoral College are not, and where political tricks, gerrymandering, the manipulation of electoral districts, but also voter suppression have become an instrument of the Republican Party increasingly, and unfortunately so, a party that knows that it finds itself in a structural minority in this country, but still manages to eke out majorities in important states and at times in the Electoral College. This is and I don't want to evaluate this any further, but this is a political structure that has moved us into a ever intensifying confrontation about the fundamentals of our democracy in the United States. And unfortunately, the Constitution is as old as it is. There are certain advantages to have 200 years of democratic traditions. There are also disadvantages because it is a structure that is not very clear. It has aged well, but at the same time, it might not be always capable of integrating different interests and conflicts in the early 21st century. The third and last point that I'd like to mention, which is really impacting and changing the domestic environment dramatically and also directly connects with the international policy issues that we are interested in, is the impact of the Afghanistan and Iraq interventions. If you look at it only in fiscal terms, the cost of the wars that we started is about 6.4 trillion, so 6.4 billion, as you would say in Germany, dollars. Which is a direct and indirect cost associated with the war over the last 20 years of over $200 million a day. It's completely clear that that was not sustainable. And one of the reasons why the last three presidents that we elected in the United States, namely Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden, were all elected based on the promise to end these wars, it is clear that we have completely overextended our economic capacity. If you look at the three massive legislative agenda items that Joe Biden has pushed through Congress and is trying to push through Congress, the stimulus package, the infrastructure package, and then social legislation that is pending, all of them together are a little less than we've spent in these two wars over the last 20 years. And the interesting thing is that to a degree, we have lost those wars on two fronts. We have lost them in asymmetrical battles with Islamists. And you saw how the retreat from Afghanistan has kind of mirrored and codified and exemplified that. But we've also lost that war effort at home because people just don't want to be engaged in international affairs, much less military affairs any longer, and are just worn out and tired. And that is important for our European friends to understand, because if you ask people right now about Ukraine, 53% of Americans say that don't take sides. It's sad, but it's not really our business. And only about 40% here in the US say that we should support Ukraine in this current battle. So there is a very, very weak political base for the president to really move this agenda forward. And it's interesting that especially among younger people, and younger people in the United States tend to be more democratic, that in Americans under 45, there is a plurality, an absolute majority of people that do not want to engage and explicitly say we should neither support Ukraine or Russia and not get involved. And it is clear that you have a younger generation that has grown up and come to political age in the time of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars that are completely fed up with this specific form of international engagement, which is often the only form of international engagement that they have learned about. That is also very important for our European friends to understand, because it was funny when Armin Laschet during the Bundeskanzler campaign in Germany said that the Germans should establish capacities to have their own air evacuation assets when it comes to flying Germans and Europeans out of Afghanistan. That sounds nice, but the problem to a degree is that we have such overwhelming force structures here in the United States, where we moved when Kabul was evacuated, we moved within days 6,000 combat troops into the arena without really impacting ongoing operations. We organized the airlift. There were security was provided by special ops that were trained and battle hardened. The United States has regional air force and aircraft carrier battle groups at hand, and it was really a sign of how terribly the mission in Afghanistan ended, which, by the way, was the mission that had an international mandate, a UN Security Council resolution, and international support, contrary to the Iraq mission. But at the same time, it showed that the United States is the only country in the Western world that can effectively react in such situations of crisis. I mean, just to give you an example, we have 10 Nimitz-class aircraft carrier battle groups that have about twice as many planes on them than the German Air Force has at its disposal. So the disproportionality of military and political power is so enormous that we are in this conundrum that we in the United States can intervene at any place in the world, anywhere, at almost any time. But people are not really interested in doing this anymore. And Europe, where there's, for the first time, and it was palpable at the Munich Security Conference as well, a discussion about greater military spending, hard security, and need to push back against Vladimir Putin to preserve the post-World War boundaries, there is no capacity. So I think this is an environment that we need to deal with and we need to understand. It is very complicated. Last thought, and I'll end here. All of this happens in an environment where the discussion about Ukraine is completely overwhelming the transatlantic capacities. I would say stepping back a little bit from the immediacy of the conflict, this will probably turn out to be rather a secondary conflict than a primary conflict. I still think that climate change and China are the big issues that we need to keep an eye on and that we can't lose sight of, even though the situation in Ukraine is dramatic. And how in this complex environment, we can start thinking and working on what I would call the need to reconstitute the Western alliance in a political, not in a topographical sense, as an alliance that pursues universal values, that is by and large democratic and in favor of transparency and functioning global governance. That is a real big lift. And the discussions in Munich, but also more broadly here in Washington or in Berlin, seem to be somewhat cognizant of the dimensions of the challenge. But I think it is not really fully clear how difficult it will be for us to structure the 21st century. We all feel that we live at the beginning of a new era, but we don't really know what that era is and what rules to follow and what policy strategies to implement. And for that reason, I'm grateful that we have the opportunity to discuss this a little bit tonight, and I'm very interested in hearing your reactions. So David, thank you once again for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Michael, for such a comprehensive overview of the state of the Union. We just had recently, we had, you know, Hans Demmel, he just was on talking about this book. I don't know why it's blocking it off, but Andersveld. And he was talking about, he said that, especially with all the protests going on against COVID and sort of this this polarization that's happened, also as you see in the US with the Republican Party, And then this weekend we saw the Canadian past week the Canadian trucker strike, and that's also supposed to be coming now this weekend to Washington D.C. And another point of contention with the U.S. was always about Nord Stream 2, and with this transatlantic relationship, that was definitely seemed to be one of the hot topics between the two countries. And then seems like with the drop of a hat, it was just announced that the Nord Stream 2 will be dropped as the first sanctions from Scholz. Yet he didn't seem to let on, even as of just a couple of days ago. How was that? Did that come up in discussion in Munich? And also, what will be the impact? Because Hans Demmel said that if the prices of fuel, well, I know that's natural gas, but if fuel goes up, energy prices go up, people will be on the streets here. How was that discussed in Munich last week?
Yeah, very good question. Let me just start with one word on Canada, which is interesting because the Canadian truckers, they got over $10 million of donations through a Christian fundamentalist website, because the traditional fundraising websites wouldn't raise money for them because there were too many people with swastikas running around. And that website got hacked, and the data has been made public, and the first analyses are ours, and it's out. It's fascinating. 42% of the money that the truckers in Canada got as to support their protests came from the United States. And the overwhelming majority of that money came from some of the wealthiest zip codes in the United States. And since some of the people also left their mail addresses, the Washington Post and New York Times started contacting people, which in the majority were Republicans. And it turned out that this is prosperous, well-established American middle classes that supported this protest in a foreign country, which is interesting and goes to your point that for the first time in recent Western history, we have a massively anti-Western resentment and political movement inside our own Western countries. That's qualitatively new, and I don't think we have a good solution to that. Nord Stream 2. I mean, I am so done with Nord Stream 2 because this is a discussion that has gone on for years, and it has been a poison pill for German-American relations, which I think has to do with an amount of neglect on both sides. I think the Germans haven't really taken Nord Stream serious because Obama started talking about Nord Stream, and everybody still thought, oh, we can muddle through and this is not going to be as serious. And then obviously became one of the most important political issues, including the threat of sanctions against German officials here from the US side. And on the US side, I think from the side of the politicians and the US Congress, there was always a slightly exaggerated notion that Nord Stream 1, nobody really wanted to talk about, but Nord Stream 2 was a nail in the coffin of German independence and would expose the country to Russia in a completely irresponsible way. I think both positions were probably a little exaggerated, the German side on the neglect side and our side here on the exaggeration side. But I think it's good that it's out, at least for the time being. My feeling was when Olaf Scholz did not want to mention Nord Stream here in the press conference, that was something that the Chancellery and the White House had agreed upon before, because there were 2 weeks of very intense consultations and coordinations before Olaf Scholz' visit here in Washington, which by and large I think was a good and fairly solid visit. And the agreement was that if Olaf Scholz would say yes, Nord Stream 2 is on the chopping block, that would weaken his position in the negotiations with Vladimir Putin that he would have the following week after coming to Washington. Obviously, that's all water under the bridge now with the military action moving forward. But I think that was quite acceptable in terms of political strategy. The problem is obviously that the Germans have been fast asleep. It's one of the few countries in Europe that doesn't have a single LNG terminal. You finally get one in northern Germany now, but that has taken 10 years too long. It seems to me that from the assessments that I'm hearing here from people in the intelligence community and in the Pentagon, that the Europeans can get through the rest of the winter and the rest of the year, even without Russian gas. It might also be an attractive lever because there are estimates out. I think somebody at the Kiel Institute did did an assessment that if Europeans stopped buying Russian gas, that would take almost 3% out of Russian GDP. That would be an immediate fiscal, financial, and political threat for Putin. So it's actually something that you should think about. And at the same time, I'm fairly confident, even though it's environmentally not the most attractive version, that we can ramp up gas production here in the United States to the degree that we can support the Europeans should things become complicated next winter. The South Koreans have signaled that they will send surplus LNG to Europe. So I think this has a collateral benefit for the Western community, that we've all kind of moved closer together and stand shoulder by shoulder, and even our East Asian partners get involved in thinking about how to support their European friends. That is a collateral benefit of Vladimir Putin's militaristic policy that I actually see as something that we can build upon in the future.
Thank you. We have a question from Aaron. Aaron, would you like to go ahead with your question?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Werz, for the for the whole around the world in 5-10 minutes. There used to be a show on PBS in the 80s that used to kind of do that in the news. So my question is really more about this sort of rebalancing of national security into a combination of sort of great power and hard power, not just soft power and multilateral global. And the fact that even the United States, which has, components that are positioned, whether naval or land power, in the last 20 to 30 years, there's been a huge shift away from that, let's say the end of the Cold War style of hard power. And the European allies, have basically completely disinvested in this, to the point that the Germans can't, really deploy a field-ready brigade. And so what do you see, especially in Germany, because I think Germany is very important to this, especially from a Polish and from an Eastern European perspective. What do you see the appetite in Germany to not just invest, because it's one thing to write checks, but it's another thing to actually have in your communities, in your cities, but in your states, bases that have German brigades, and field forces and air defense forces, et cetera, and they're moving around, Eastern Europe and NATO allies. What's your appetite there, or what's your perspective on that appetite, and how much groundwork do you think is going to be needed this decade, if at all? And because if it isn't, then the shift has to go to Poland. I mean, there's just someone has to fill that vacuum that has, that's a big population-based state. So anyways, I don't know, did that question make sense or no?
Yeah, no, look,
Okay.
I agree. So this is a good point, Aaron, and I can't see your last name, so I'm going to just call you Aaron. I hope that's okay.
No, it's okay. I'll put my last name in there. I'm sorry about that. And quick other point, thank you for the mention of the US Mexico integration, because I work for the largest IT company in Mexico.
Okay. Aaron de los Reyes. Okay.
Yeah. So
okay. Aaron, I think you got a very good point. Yeah, this is a heavy lift for a new German government, especially a government where Social Democrats and Greens are the main coalition partners. At the same time, I mean, maybe they're the only ones that can move Germany into a direction where Germany talks about these issues, or Germans talk about these issues in a better informed way. After all, it was Bill Clinton, a Democrat, who ended Social Security as we know it here in the United States. So this is counterintuitive, but I would say that Olaf Scholz and Annalena Baerbock and the German cabinet has a tremendous population to talk not only to Germans but also to Europeans in order to figure out what the position of Germany within the European Union, but also in the broader neighborhood, is supposed to be. And there is no way you can delegate this to Poland or to Spain or even to France. I mean, Germany is the fourth largest economy in the world. It is, like it or not, it will be for the foreseeable future our reference point here in the United States as the key European partner, because of the size, the location, and the political and economic capacity Germany is the reference point and the anchor for a future in the European Union. So I think that discussion needs to happen. And I would say it needs to happen in a manner in which you can convince people. It is completely legitimate that a lot of people in the public arena in Germany were criticizing the chancellor and saying, send lethal weapons to Ukraine, not only your ridiculous 5,000 helmets, but at the same time, we're spending about $1,000 billion for NATO altogether a year. And I agree that 5,000 helmets might not have been the best solution, but all our hard security have not deterred Putin either. So we have to recognize that there is no one-dimensional solution where you say you need to move from A to B and then things are going to be good. This needs to be a process. I think another dimension, and that is in some way kind of maybe not directly responding to your question. I also think that we have to rethink security, maybe not in the case of direct aggression vis-a-vis Ukraine, but more broadly when it comes to military investment in a much broader context where we factor in the security dimensions of climate change, regional instability, human mobility, and so on and so forth. It is not enough to have a 1980s perspective on military security, where if you could count to 142 and knew how many warheads were there on each side, you could go to Geneva in 1982 and be part of the START nuclear arms reduction talks. We have to learn to play a three-dimensional chess game in international policy and security policy that we are not trained to play. And I think here in the United States, it is a very, very important indicator that for the first time in US history, the climate envoy of the United States, John Kerry, and the USAID administrator, Samantha Power, the equivalent of the German Bundesministerium für wirtschaftliche Zusammenarbeit, are sitting in the National Security Council. And when decisions about life and death and war and peace are being made in the United States, they're at the table, which shows that we are trying to implement structures to develop a much more broader notion of what security actually means. I think this needs to be part of the discussion. And I would also say, for political reasons, this is probably an angle where you could start talking about, that you could start talking about in a German environment and would find more support than just minimizing the conversation and ask people, do we send lethal weapons to Ukraine or don't we?
Thank you. I'd like to now go to Yasmin.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Mr. Werz, that I can address my question to you. I asked David to ask you one question, but if I may, and to not pretend that I have a follow-up question, I would like to squeeze in two, which are not too complicated, though, I believe. What I would like to know, you were earlier referring to people who are more experts in relationships as opposed to being country experts. Yeah. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit further, because I'm not quite sure who you're referring to. Are you referring to policymakers, and what specifically do you mean by that? I mean, technically, I would say it's a good thing to be firm in dealing with relationships, but are you basically saying that they don't know anything about the countries they are dealing with? Is that your point? Plus, I'm not always sure who are you referring to when you're talking about us. Are you talking about the US perspective or the German perspective? If you could clarify, that would be very helpful. Thanks. And the second question I have, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about in that context of security, about the peace movement in the United States, what they have to say regarding the very current issue and situation we are all facing. There is a tradition in it in the US, and since you were referring to, not wanting to be willing to get engaged on neither side, I was wondering if there is a reference to be made in that perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Katami. I appreciate the questions. The us is the easiest one, so let's take that first. I'm a proud dual citizen, and I've been paying my taxes in the United States for the last 20 years. So the us is my taxpayer, first person plural, here in the United States. When I talk about the relationship, I indeed mean policymakers and also members of government. Let me just give you anecdotal evidence, and maybe that clarifies things a little bit. And I do think, indeed, that you need to know much more about the domestic political dynamics of any country you're dealing with to be able to conduct foreign policy compared to 10, 15, or 20 years ago. Because if you don't understand the domestic drivers that are so much more prominent in decision-making when it comes to foreign policy, you are likely to misunderstand the other side. That is my theoretical argument. Let me give you one example what I mean by relationship experts. Germany is probably the most overrepresented country here in Washington. There are more German American institutions than you will ever see in any other part of the world. There is the BMW Center at Georgetown University, the Europe Center at Johns Hopkins, there's the German Marshall Fund, the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies, a number of smaller institutions. There are 4 party foundation offices. And what happens is that we often have visitors from Berlin, Bundestag delegations, or members of the government that come to Washington, have a meeting at the State Department, have a meeting at the National Security Council. If they're lucky, they have a meeting at the NSC, and sometimes they see a member of Congress, but that's often not happening. Then they go to the German Marshall Fund and to Georgetown University, and then they do a dinner at their party foundation, and they go back to Berlin and they say, I have been in the United States. That's a grave misperception, because these institutions are filled with people that are extremely competent and knowledgeable, but they study Germany all day, and they often also get federal funds from Germany. So they have vested interests to strengthen that particular dimension of the relationship. Whereas American society, and Aaron will know this, is undergoing a dramatic transformation where kids under 20 are not majority white anymore, where an entire new generation of Americans is growing up that has family, linguistic, and cultural ties to the Pacific Rim and to the Western Hemisphere, but not to Europe any longer, and where the biggest transatlantic exchange machine has basically ended, which was the US Army with 140,000 troops in Germany in three-year rotations, which for many working class Americans was the only time they have ever visited Europe. And so I think the point here is that the United States as a society, we are much more dynamic and much younger than European societies. Things happen faster here. We have a shift of population. If you look at the census data of the last 30 years, there's a mathematical center of population in the United States. That center of population is moving from northeast to southwest 20 meters a day. So we are physically moving away from Europe. And I feel that those dynamics that are shaping politics in already and will shape them even more dramatically in the next generation here in the United States, they are often completely ignored and misunderstood in Europe. And so that's why I say there are a lot of people that know all the technicalities of what has happened in the bilateral relationship, but you need a deeper understanding of what's happening, what is happening in American society, to not misread the way our politics will shape when it relates to international actors, international institutions, and bilateral relationships.
Which applies to any country, I suppose, from your perspective. I mean, not only for US-German relationships.
I would say it is different, for example, with Mexico, completely different, because the Mexicans have 50 consulates here in the United States. It's the tightest bilateral relationship you can imagine. There are 36 million Mexican Americans in this country. I think it is partially different with countries like the Philippines, Vietnam, Taiwan, because you have very vocal, and India, and very vocal, educated middle-class segments of those countries that are first and second generation immigrants here in the United States that have strong personal, family, and also in the case of India, economic ties to their home country or the home country of their parents. So I feel that there is more proximity in terms of feeling the vibration and the changes of other societies. Germany is not one of those. It's a highly professionalized and highly institutionalized relationship that has advantages, but I would just submit to your consideration that it also has some disadvantages.
What about my second question?
Remind me, I apologize.
Well, my question was about the peace movement in the United States, regarding you saying earlier that the majority of especially younger Americans would prefer not to get engaged in neither side. And I was wondering, how is that? I mean, wasn't there a concept about regarding, let's make peace and not war? What about that?
No, the short answer is no. Peace movement doesn't play any role in the political debates. There's no social movement, partially because everybody is exhausted, and the wars that we fought in Iraq and Afghanistan were asymmetrical, not only in the way we conducted or had to conduct the wars on the ground. They were asymmetrical as well here in US society, because only a little over 1% of Americans served in the wars. So these were wars that to a degree happened without us feeling the direct impact as regular citizens of the country. This was very different than in Vietnam. In the Vietnam era, the political opposition against the war, and there's a convergence to a degree among conservatives and very progressive Democrats, is that the United States should disengage from the international arena to a much larger degree, and that military intervention, but also the deployment of massive assets and the engagement with our partners in military cooperation should be toned down and reduced. And there's actually an institute that was established here in Washington, one of the many of the 200 think tanks in town 2 years ago. It's called the Quincy Institute, which was funded by George Soros and the Koch brothers. People that know the inside lingo here in the United States that know that George Soros obviously is a very progressive donor. The Koch brothers are conservative segment within the Republican Party. And one of the main issues of that institute is criticizing what we call the forever wars that go on for decades and decades, and reconfigure the way the United States engages or does not engage with the world. So there's rather kind of a agreement within the political spectrum of doing less, but not a social movement that is discernible in any way, shape, or form. Most of the social movements that we're seeing right now are as introspective as our politics tend to be. They're along the lines of racial equity, social justice, housing, climate change, and health issues.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Yasmin. Thanks, Michael. Another person we had on recently, hope this book shows up, Strongmen, How They Rise, How They Fall, by Ruth Ben-Ghiat. And she basically talked about the similarities between, say, Trump and Putin and other Mussolini and people that she had studied. And now what's going on, if you saw the comments that Trump made yesterday, and too bad that he didn't make it in time for you all to be at the Munich Security Conference to hear the residents there. In his statement that he basically is supporting what Putin is doing, and it was definitely a break from what Republican stance has always been. What kind of effect do you think this will have with the U.S. not having a unified voice? How will that play out, and what type of ramifications will that have in the United States?
Very good question, David. It's for the first time in recent history that we have massive partisan disagreements on foreign affairs. This traditionally has not been the case. One also has to recognize that things were a little easier during the Cold War. It was easier to know who were the bad guys and convince ourselves that we were the good guys. But the disarray in our foreign policy assessments, and this is also true for parts of the Democratic Party, as I just mentioned, where you have the progressive wing that really wants to disengage in a much more radical manner than even Obama did in his 2 terms. But certainly more dramatic is the outspoken admiration for authoritarian leadership that you see within segments of the Republican Party. And unfortunately, Donald Trump is not a lone voice here. The fact that he basically said Putin is a genius in the way he organized the invasion is absolutely detrimental to our standing in the world, to our respectability when it comes to our partners. It is disastrous when it comes to our arguments that rules and international law and post-World War borders need to be respected. But he is not alone, and I think he is as much a accelerator as a representation of a current trend within American conservatism that is similar to what has happened in England over the past 20 years, where you have an ideological radicalization, which is partially understandable when it's about what we euphemistically call non-college whites, which is basically the rural hillbillies. But it is absolutely stunning to see that prosperous middle-class Americans increasingly buy into this worldview. Just to give you one example, Donald Trump had a little over 60% support among inscribed Republicans in 2016 when he got elected, which means that a lot of traditional Republicans, moderate Republicans, kind of closed the eyes, got a little bit of goosebumps and maybe skin rash and voted for him and said, I vote for him because I don't like Hillary and he's a Republican. That support within his own party has risen to close to 90% now, which means that after those 4 years of Donald Trump with kind of undermining NATO, alienating our allies, putting Latino children into cages, and a long list of other things, including throwing so many classified papers away that the toilets clogged several times in the White House. After those 4 years, he expanded his support within the Republican Party by 50%. And this shows you that authoritarian orientations are like a virus. They are an infectious disease. And it seems that a lot of people are vulnerable to these worldviews and now more or less fully support him because, as you know, he received 75 million votes in 2020. And even if you count out 12 to 14 million votes from disenfranchised rural white labor class, then you still end up with 60 million Americans. That's close to the population of Germany and more than in France. 60 million Americans that thought re-electing Donald Trump and possibly ending democracy as we know it in the United States was a good idea. So that's something that we will have to grapple with, and it is not going away with Donald Trump going away. There is even a current in his party developing that is to the right of Donald Trump. And you see that the main contenders for the 2024 presidential nomination in the Republican Party, namely Governor DeSantis in Florida and Governor Abbott in Texas, try to position themselves as even more hardline than Donald Trump. And the Republican National Committee, the RNC, has not only in the last election decided not to publish a party platform, a Parteiprogramm, basically saying whatever Donald Trump says is the opinion of the party. They have just in the process of changing their bylaws to making it impossible for any presidential candidate of the Republican Party to participate in the presidential debates in 2024. And they also tried, as you probably know, to throw the last two remaining dissidents, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, out of the Republican Party. There were some establishment Republicans that said, just censor them, which has no direct implications. The compromise for not throwing Kinzinger and Liz Cheney out of the party, but just censoring them, was that the RNC passed a resolution in which it said that the protests of January 6th were a legitimate expression of political will. And I have been down in a safe distance, but I've gone down to the Capitol on January 6th. And I must say, this is as close to a fascist mob as I've ever seen in my life. And to call that a legitimate expression of political will is showing you that there are a lot of people that are completely willing to take a chainsaw and start working on the foundations of our democracy here in the US.
Well, you said that the Republican Party basically has no platform right now. It seems that their only raison d'etre is to oppose the Democrats. And also some pundits have been saying that Trump was complaining that Putin didn't invade Ukraine during his watch, but some are saying that he didn't have to, because what Trump did by pulling out all the support for Ukraine in the last few years, and also taking a wrecking ball to NATO, that he was doing a better job than Putin ever could have done for himself. How do you think that is there some sort of understanding here between Trump and Putin? Is part of what's Putin doing? Is that also something just to put Biden in a difficult situation?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that Donald Trump is a major factor in Putin's calculations right now. I mean, Vladimir Putin exactly knows that this was an opportunity for him to basically let loose a test balloon to see if he could divide the West. My feeling is that there was a little bit of an assessment in Moscow that the new German government, and maybe that's Gerhard Schröder's doing, that the German government was not really a safe bet for the Western alliance, and that Putin could somehow break them out of the united front on the Western side. That obviously didn't work out at all, and rather backfired. So I think for Putin, the strategic assessment is you never can stand still as an authoritarian leader. We've seen this with Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia, who started 4 wars over a decade in order to maintain power. But at the same time, Vladimir Putin knows that he's laying bare fissures and contradictions within the Western alliance, especially with some of the Eastern European countries being much more sympathetic to his authoritarian rule than to the democratic regulations and rules of the European Union. So I think this is a make or break point for a moment for many, including the European Union, the German government, to a certain degree, the Putin archaic system that has been established in Moscow, but also for the Biden administration. And obviously, this is again an asymmetrical conflict that is very difficult to respond to, because we can't really respond to what has happened. And even if there's a full-fledged invasion with military force, that would be not in our own best interest. It also would be not responsible to start a shooting war at the borders of our East European allies. At the same time, maybe if we take the long view and also realize that Russia has failed to modernize its economy, that it has dreadful demographic developments with mortality, especially of Russian men being in their mid-60s, very little innovation, that maybe we have to become more accustomed to the notion that we have to wear them down once again, as we did during the Cold War. And if Putin thinks that he can, in a globalized and economically integrated world, just start his tiny little wars and not suffer any consequences, I think he might be mistaken. And these sanctions will become more and more stinging and more drastic. And the political questions rather is, are we as Americans and are Europeans willing to pay a price to defend a sovereign country and say sovereign countries must be respected? And if they are not, then we are willing also to put our money and our resources where our mouth is.
How do you see the relationship now, since it was a bit of probably the low point between Merkel and Trump, the transatlantic relationship, the U.S.-Germany relationship? How do you see the future of the relationship now, the way it's especially developing very quickly now with Scholz and Biden?
Look, I'm moderately optimistic. The last 2 weeks were a crash course for Olaf Scholz in transatlantic cooperation and German-American cooperation. He had a chance to sit down for almost an hour with Tony Blinken when Tony Blinken visited Berlin a few weeks back. So personal relationships are starting to develop. It was interesting at the Munich Security Conference when Olaf Scholz gave a relatively strong speech on Ukraine, mentioned the sanctions regime, also pointed out that there are democratic deficits in Ukraine, which I think is an important point that we often forget over here. Talked about the need to get the Iran negotiations back onto track. And then former Senator Lieberman got up in the audience and said, Chancellor Scholz, we are just learning to know you. You're a new person for us, but what you've just said is extremely reassuring to me. That shows that there is a certain recognition that not that much has changed in Germany. Olaf Scholz is not radically different from Angela Merkel. The government looks a little different, but by and large, the German alliances, the broader policy issues, they are clear. And I think there's an appreciation on the American side that the Germans have moved forward on climate issues that are very important for us and also very important for younger generation here in the United States, and that the new German government will be more critical on China than Merkel's government was, and that is a big asset and a big plus from our perspective.
Well, thank you. Looks like we have our time has come to an end here. Thank you so much, Michael Werz, for joining us here. Glad that you could be part of the American Club tonight and giving us the latest from the Munich Security Conference and your views of the transatlantic relationship.
My pleasure entirely. Thank you so much for having me. I saw that there are still a few hands up. If you guys want to share my email.
Do you have time to stay?
And I have 10 more minutes. Yes.
Okay, 10 minutes. Then I
Unless
will
you guys are getting
to...
tired in Hamburg.
No, I didn't know if you had to leave. We'll go to Peter. Peter, you had a question? You got it. You're on mute, Peter.
Hang on.
Yep.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much. But I would like to know if you could indulge a bit on the so-called replacement theaters. I'm sorry to come back to Nord Stream 2, but I have no idea whether anyone in this group is familiar with the numbers. As an engineer, I do stick to numbers. And the capacity of Nord Stream 2 is 55 billion cubic meters. The so-called relief 10 LNG boats, which were sent by the United States in December, 10 boats, were the equivalent of 5 million cubic meters. So there's a little factor of 11,000 between the two. Now, we all know that Nord Stream 1 was built because the unstable partner was Ukraine, permanently diverting volumes. Number 2 is entirely built to the Nord Stream 2 is entirely due to what the Wall Street Journal calls the world's dumbest energy policy. Now, in these so-called replacement theaters, in these so-called replacement theaters about how to overcome if these 55 billion cubic meters don't materialize, could you indulge on these? Were these any topic in Munich or elsewhere? Does anyone consider how to replace these volumes?
Yeah, thank you. And you know this much better than I do. I'm not an energy expert. I can only repeat what I hear from people that know this much better. It seems that there's 35 billion cubic meter capacity of LNG intake. If you look at all the European LNG ports that are available, especially in Spain and in Holland, there seems to be a bottleneck in some of the inner European gas pipelines, especially from Spain to France and also towards Austria and the northern part of the former Yugoslavia. I don't think that this is going to be easy in any way, shape, or form. At the same time, there is a year's worth of time now, and it is also clear that the economic damage for Vladimir Putin and the regime in Moscow would be quite considerable if they were not to deliver gas. I cannot fathom a situation or imagine a situation in which Europe in next winter wouldn't find solutions. But then again, I'm not an expert. You know this better than I do, and I hope if at all, this is a wake-up call for Europe to become more energy independent. And if this means a mix of renewable and French nuclear as bridge technology, so be it. I think there's enough energy production capacity within Europe to address these issues, but you need joint strategies and substantial investments. And if that is what Europeans need to do, this is what Europeans probably will do.
Thanks. Thanks for taking a couple extra minutes here, sure. Michael. We have Bjorn. You have a question?
Yeah, a very quick question, but I think it needs a long answer. You said that we have to maybe get accustomed to wear them down again. Yeah, Russians that time, last time the Soviet Union. But the problem is, a few minutes before you said that there are people taking a chainsaw to the basis of the American Constitution. So that probably will change things a little bit, right? Last time we had Ronald Reagan. This time we may have, I don't know, Trump too, or whoever. Do we stand a chance when this happens?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for putting your finger on a very, very sore spot. You're absolutely right. I would say that the threat that is emanating from Putin's actions in Ukraine is less dramatic for us here in Washington than the domestic threat from anti-democratic forces that we are seeing. It's also, as of last year, the FBI, for example, has an assessment out that neo-Nazi groups and domestic homegrown terrorism is the biggest threat to American security. So it's after 20 years of war on terror, where we went to 80 countries to pursue Islamist terrorist networks, that this now comes home to haunt us to a degree is ironic, but very serious. And I think, I would hope that the confrontation with Vladimir Putin and the close cooperation with our European and our Asian partners will create a domestic situation in which we are better able to argue that as a democratic country, we can weather these challenges, and that we will also be able to economically and politically move forward. But this, as I mentioned before, is far from clear. 2024 is going to be a fateful election for the United States and by extension for the rest of the world. And I don't think it's very likely that Donald Trump is going to be reelected. If he wants the nomination of the Republican Party, he'll get it within a 5-minute process. But I also can't look any European policymaker in the eye, or you for that matter, and say it is absolutely not going to happen, because there is a risk that there is enough dynamic going into his direction. We don't know the answers to this, but I think the point is that we are living in a pivotal moment in our Western democracies, and we certainly want to have answers if 20 years from now, younger people ask us, did you do enough, and what did you do to make sure that democracy, constitutions, and open societies survive, that we are not going to be as speechless as many of our grandfathers' generation turned out to be.
So we have to hope that Putin unites us the same way he's uniting Ukraine, right?
To a degree, there are collateral benefits to what he's doing. It is undeniable. Is that enough? Obviously not. I mean, we need to kind of get this done ourselves, and hopefully it will happen.
Thank you.
Hey, just one quick follow-up question from Aaron. Go ahead, Aaron, make it really short, please.
Yes, great. To try to focus on the positive also. I see a lot of German business people, especially in Mexico and the US, the Southeast, Southwest now, especially Texas, in the automotive and value chains. I don't see them connected to that DC Beltway that you talk about, which we know about, those few hundred people who work full-time in the sort of German American foreign policy. There seems to be that disconnect, and I don't know if this is correct. Is it a Mittelstand issue? You know, like these are smaller, mid-sized companies. They're not as respected in that sort of elite circles from a German perspective, because I see them like actively, you know, on a regular basis.
Yes, that has to do with the size of the company, obviously, especially the German Mittelstand, which at times has like billions euros worth of business and is very international, does not really do the policy assessment and planning and like long-term strategic outreach very well, because they have never trained themselves to do so, and sometimes it's also a question of capacity. Even larger German companies, until a few years back, I think Audi in Ingolstadt had 4 people in their global policy team, which was, we were looking at the entire world, where Audi was selling close to 2 million vehicles a year at the time. There's a serious deficit, especially in the private sector, when it comes to strategic assessments and planning and looking at possible scenarios. At the same time, I completely fail to understand that from a European perspective, that so many Europeans do not understand that they have to look at the United States and Mexico as one entity when it comes to transatlantic relations. I'm always telling people in the Auswärtiges Amt, especially with the growing Latino community here, which doesn't know anything about Germany and is going to run the future and influence the future of the country, that they can't figure out a way to send German diplomats to Mexico City for a year and then to Washington so they speak Spanish and have street cred to interact with the community. You have over 1,200 German companies in Mexico. Mexico is by far the most influential country here in the United States. These are all unused assets of German and European foreign policy, because people don't realize that this is all called North America for a reason. You won't believe how often I have German visitors here and they tell me that Mexico is South America, and you ask yourself, what have they done in geography class? So there are a lot of political opportunities. I'm glad you point them out. I think it will be important to move into that direction, because especially Germany.
One other quick point that most people don't know: the fastest growing football league that's followed in Mexico is the Bundesliga. And no, I mean, it's a serious thing. I mean, it's people will watch that with the EPL and the Liga MX like, together. I mean, it's a real thing.
Yeah. It's one North American continent. You have to factor that into your political calculations and in the way you think about transatlantic context.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for hanging in there and staying a few extra minutes with us. We could probably go all night. It's obviously so much to talk about, and especially now with what's happened in Ukraine. As you know, we'll see. We'll hope for the best here. Thanks for joining us. If just as a reminder, we have some in-person events coming up on March 8th and April 5th. So check on our website, americanclub.de, and you can register for the events there, and also register for the newsletter so you get all of our invitations. I think we've held about 50 events since COVID, so we keep going strong here, and soon we'll be having a lot more events in person. So great to see everyone. Stay safe, and looking forward to seeing you again. Good night.
Thank you so much for a
Thank
great
you,
discussion.
everyone. Thank
Goodbye.
you.
Thank you so much.
Bye to Washington.